Yes, indeed, it has grown to become a nice big family of X vehicles from BMW. I am in Spartanburg, South Carolina in the United States, where most of these cars are made, and it is the new X4 that brings me here. Welcome to the Car and Bike Show. I'm Siddharth Vinayak Patankar. Details on this car coming up. BMW X4 represents a segment many like to scoff at, but yet one that's become a volume spinner for many car makers brave enough to go there. The X4 was conceived as a baby X6 and more like an afterthought when it first came in 2014, almost as a variant to the then second generation X3, a car that was already at its midlife point. But when BMW went in for the new generation X3, it also decided to go ahead and make a new generation X4 too. So, a new model change coming just 4 years into a car's life is a surprise, but now you at least understand why it happened. And by the way, the last car sold over 200,000 units worldwide. Right, so what is the new second generation X4 all about then? I'm in Spartanburg, South Carolina, where it's built, to find out. Call it the sportier alter ego of the X3 because that is what it is. Its coupe styling with the sloping rear and flared wings do say that for sure. But it also gets a firmer suspension, wider rear track, bigger wheels, while maintaining a fair amount of, dare I say, practicality. So the sloping roof meets the body fairly high up to afford decent cabin space. Its polygonal wheel arches are wide and have ample travel to allow for some rough roading too. But yes, it is similar to the X3, and also similar is the engine lineup. But I focused my attention on the X4 M40d, the likely model for India when the car gets here in a few months' time. Also, to quickly get it out of the way, the X4 will be a niche offering in India, positioned above the X3, and like I said, with just one or maybe two engines, with only top-end trims. So being positioned just a little bit higher than the X3 and also being the latest in the X lineup, of course the X4 gets everything new in terms of all the gadgets and all the fun stuff on the inside. So, you know, when it comes to the virtual cluster or the gesture control, you've got all that pretty much down pat. It's also a nice sporty trim inside the cabin, especially this one, because of course I'm driving the M Sport trim. Cabin itself is a little bit roomier and therefore more appealing as well compared to the last cars. In fact, you get 27mm of enhanced legroom as well. So similar interior and engines as the X3. Is this then simply the X3 Coupe? Well, it's a completely different tuning on the chassis, and so you get a much stiffer car. The M Sport badge brings adaptive dampers to the party, which really show up when you corner the car hard. Now the X4 shares its chassis and most of its components with the X3, but there are a few specific differences thrown in to give the car a more agile, more sporty character, which is non-SUV like almost. And so the variable sport steering is a big part of that, because what it does is at higher speeds it gives you a lot more adaptability and the car becomes more intuitive. I drove the X4 extensively on roads that crisscrossed the South and North Carolina border. I got a fair share of narrow roads, broken roads, country roads, and some smooth highway too. Now in South Carolina we don't have very fast speed limits, so for the most part the best I've gotten is about 55 miles per hour, but finally we've entered this little wooded stretch, and at least it's a nice curvy road, so I'm getting a chance to experience the agility of the car. Though I have to say that the real test of that is going to come to life when I get it onto the test track back at the BMW plant. It's the sense of control and sheer grip that will grab you. At lower speeds, the car's steering is a bit heavier than I would have liked, and its gear changes are dulled when you put it into comfort mode with an excessive delay in changes, especially when using the paddles. The four-wheel drive with its variable torque split does the job well though, to send torque back when you step on it, and the car will get you out of sticky spots quickly. In sport mode, it is quite the hoot, though the XDRIVE 30i was a touch more responsive. Yes, that petrol variant is also being considered for India, though we are likely to get just that top-end diesel at the start, like I already told you. Now you guys are probably really tired of hearing me saying this, but levels of refinement and more car-like experience on SUVs, I mean, these are two things that just keep going up and up and up from pretty much every manufacturer, especially manufacturers like BMW. So the engine, wow, it doesn't even feel like a diesel, to be very honest. And yes, I have to say extremely refined, extremely satisfying too, in terms of its power delivery and the ample torque that I have at hand. We got rather lucky finding this little aviation company as we drove along. Its kind proprietor was generous enough to allow us to let the X4 pose alongside this beautiful and vintage 1946 Piper Cub light aircraft. Now, of the 6X models, 3 of them are Sport Activity Coupes, and this of course sits in the middle of that lineup, so I don't have to tell you why it's called that. You compare to the X3 and you see how significantly different this car is. So it's grown in length, in width, and even the wheelbase is longer than the first generation of the X4. And of course, you've got a lot of muscle up there in the hood, looks nice, a lot of muscle here on the side flanks as well, which has been well sculpted. And then back here is where of course everything dramatically changes. And unlike the last car, where you really have to look twice to say, is that an X6? The tail light and the rear is very distinctive and gives the car its own character. But I still struggle to find sheer beauty in that metal because, let's be frank, that segment is just weird looking. GLC Coupe and Range Rover Velar notwithstanding. Still, it's a whole lot better looking and sexier than the last X4, especially those tail lights. Inside the cabin, the styling is young, fresh, and with the all-black treatment on the M Sport trim that I'm driving, a tad distinct from the X3 interior. Well, only just, because the dash layout and equipment is definitely identical. So you get everything from wireless phone charging to Apple CarPlay, a touchscreen with the latest iDrive to the head-up display, and the aluminium housing for the upper dash and floating central console. The seats are comfortable, though I'd have expected sportier race seats, to be honest. The short sporty gear shift and the drive mode buttons on its left are also identical to the X3's, though the instruments get a slight tweak. So on to BMW's test track at its plant then. The small track had 2 sections, the circuit-like track with bends and curves and some small elevation changes, and also a skid pad for testing it in the wet. The former lets you really get a good sense of that grip and cornering ability I spoke of earlier. What's really nice though is how nice and fun and sporty the engine also sounds now that I'm pushing it out here on the track. I think the stark difference between the last generation or the first X4 and this one is that it's not just sporty in its overall appeal or styling, it's also definitely a lot more dynamic than the last car. And yes, of course, having the M Sport trim helps that cause even more, because on this one the adaptive suspension is standard. Well, push the car hard across the corners, and the thing that really strikes you is how nice and flat it stays and just how quickly the car adapts to what you are trying to do. And it stays close to the ground, and this is where the fact that it is a coupe and very different to the X3 also really comes to the fore. That done, it was time to get into the wet. And even though I had done this with the X6 4 years ago at this very location, it was way more fun in the shorter, smaller car. We got the chance to drive with traction control on, partially turned off, and then completely off. I have to say, in these situations, the steering really shone bright and did not seem heavy at all, thanks to the variable sport steering, no doubt. That does really well at higher speeds then. With the track bits done, I had some time left to get more miles down on the X4, and so I set out on the highway once again. Now the 40D is the most powerful diesel. Of course, the range starts with the 20D, not surprisingly. That is not being considered for India. Now, personally, I would think that's a mistake, because of course I'd love for all of you to have all the variety out there, but given the way the competition has mapped the coupes, they're all positioned as these niche high-end offerings. Look at the GLC coupe, for example. Yeah, I think getting the M Sport trim as standard, fully loaded, kind of high-end, that's not surprising. So we could also get the 30i, or maybe even, again, just the M Sport trim on the petrol as well, but the 40D looks more or less a given. So expect the car to be priced at around 60 to 65 lakh rupees when it gets to us in early 2019, and it is expected to be assembled at BMW's Chennai plant just like its siblings. A welcome addition? Yes, to an extent. But I wish BMW would think of its other sports activity coupe too. The gorgeous little X2. Well, sadly, that is ruled out. For now, anyway.